Welcome back to the Burn Bag Podcast. I am Ryan, joined by Andre. Andre, we have a fascinating episode that is releasing today, but I want to just kind of ask how you are. How are you at your goal of 10 pounds?
I'm straddling the border. I'm straddling the border. I am point 0.6 away. At least I was 0.6 away on my lowest weighing time. So 0.6 away. It's gonna happen. I am not gonna weigh myself until Tuesday just because this weekend's been a bit interesting. So almost there, Ryan. Almost there. How are you doing?
I'm doing well. And for all of you listening, if you don't already know, Andre has been going through his goal to lose a good amount of weight, considering he bulked up while he was in Sri Lanka for the month of
Not
August.
in the good way either. Not in the good way.
That's fair enough, but I'm glad to see that you're almost very close at your goal, and I imagine you'll get to it. I'm doing well, just busy, with the podcast and school and all the other things. Trying to enjoy fall weather in DC. Went to a Nats game on Friday. We lost, but it beats being really a Detroit sports fan. For all of you Detroiters possibly listening, you know my pain.
Well, at least we had a University of Michigan to fall back on. At least basketball. Well, football's been doing all right. I was sort of sad about how we beat Rutgers by significantly less than we used to. That concerns me, but I'm also not like a big whiz on sports knowledge, but I'm just looking forward to March Madness again.
Well, yeah, I mean, hey, it's crazy that we've flown by, but yeah, I mean, given what happened or didn't happen last year, I think everyone's looking forward to it. At least some people are. Anyway, we're not here to talk about any of that stuff, but I'm glad that we can catch up and give our listeners a bit of that we're normal people. We have normal conversations as well, but
Yeah, Ryan, it's not like I talk to you outside of this podcast. It's not at all like we talk outside of this
never.
podcast.
All right. Anyway, Andre, who is the guest of the day?
So I'm very excited about this conversation because this is a guy. I remember when I was a kid, I used to watch This Week. And I think This Week right now is hosted with George Stephanopoulos. And George Will, our guest, iconic political columnist. He is a conservative political columnist, but he's been writing for the Washington Post since 1974. And I mentioned This Week because as a kid, I used to watch him every Sunday morning on This Week. He was the guy with the glasses who was a conservative. And he made a lot of like interesting points. And I mean, literally, I'd see him on TV all the time. And the fact that we had the opportunity to interview him was a pretty cool experience, honestly. Like, whether you agree with him or you disagree with him, interviewing someone like that is just a cool experience. So, yeah, as I've said, writing a column for the Washington Post since 1974, that's since Richard Nixon's presidency. The guy knows the Republican Party. The guy knows conservatism. He was educated at Trinity College, Oxford University, Princeton University. He used to have dinners with Ronald Reagan. Reagan would call him up if he didn't like a column. He's seen the Republican Party essentially transform since, he was, really getting into this stuff. And obviously, we've seen the Republican Party transform very much so in the past few decades. But this episode in particular focuses on George Will's view on what a conservative foreign policy would look like.
Absolutely. And I just want to mention that this episode is a part of our series, The Opening of the American Mind. And really the kind of the goal of this episode, and as you'll hear as you listen to the podcast, is we're trying to understand kind of the baseline conception of what a conservative foreign policy is, because, while we have a Democrat president, we have Joe Biden, politics in the United States moves very quickly. And so it's always important to understand the ideas underpinning certain ideologies and parties, and because that has impacts both at home and abroad, our activities abroad. And we really do have a kind of a broad conversation about all the different types of foreign policies that come from the Republican Party, most notably the difference between conservative and neoconservative. We even talk about intellectual conservatism, which, of course, Dr. Will has a lot of interesting insight on. He, I believe, is a huge contributor to this intellectual conservatism in his life and career. And so I'd say pay attention to kind of how he describes a conservative foreign policy, because when you think about it, it does it kind of makes sense when you look at how certain presidents have acted in foreign policy, but also in some ways, some quote unquote conservative presidents may not have had the most conservative foreign policies, interestingly enough, and we get into that.
Yeah, absolutely. So we'll talk a bit more about that after the episode, but for now, Dr. George Will, a great conversation. So Dr. Will, thank you so much for joining us here today.
Glad to be with you.
So the first question, I sort of want to talk about the ideological foundations of a conservative foreign policy. So before we get into that, in your view, what is conservatism and how does someone or something emulate it?
Well, I think the best way to plunge into that oceanic question is to answer the question most frequently and properly asked of conservatives, which is, what do you want to conserve? And the answer is the American founding, which has three propositions. Basically, there is a human nature. It is constant and unchanging. That is to say, we're not just creatures that acquire the impress of whatever culture we're situated in. Second, there are natural rights. That is, rights crucial to the flourishing of creatures of such a nature. Third, there is an institutional architecture of government dictated by this, that first come rights, then comes government. Government exists in the language of the Declaration to secure our rights, not to give us our rights. And so we need a government capable of acting, but not capable of acting too swiftly and intemperately. We need a government strong enough to protect our rights, but not so strong that it threatens them. That's the basis of conservatism in the United States. Conservatism abroad and in Europe had different impulses and was more susceptible to blood and soil, throne and altar, hierarchical society defenses than the United States was. Built into this, and this is relevant to your interest in foreign policy, because the United States founding is wrapped up with universalist claims, there is a tendency that is A, good, and B, problematic to, let's call it a missionary impulse in American foreign policy, that because we are custodians of propositions announced at our outset to be A, self-evident, and B, universally true, you cannot understand American foreign policy without accommodating that great fact.
Certainly. So when we talk about conservatism, especially in the post-World War II era, I guess a lot of folks in our audience might view the conservatism that you sort of discuss a bit differently from the conservatism that we see today, the quote-unquote conservatism. So I just want to touch on intellectual conservatism. What has its place been in the post-war era?
Post-war conservatism, and there really wasn't an intellectual conservative movement prior to that of any significance. Post-war conservatism was heavily intellectual and bookish even. The first sort of great canonical text of the post-war conservative advance was Richard Weaver, University of Chicago professor's book titled Ideas Have Consequences, to which I would add, only ideas have large and lasting consequences. But that was followed by Bill Buckley's Up from Liberalism and God and Man at Yale and Russell Kirk's The Conservative Mind, to the point that Pat Moynihan, a good New Deal liberal Democrat from New York, who was also one of my very best friends, said in the 1970s, something momentous has happened in the United States. The Republican Party has become the party of ideas. The Democratic Party was increasingly a party of a coalition of interests, and the Republican Party was, as I say, bookish. And in many ways, at one point, sort of organized around a journal with whopping 5,000 readers, but very influential readers, the Public Interest. Conservatism has, far from being inherently anti-intellectual, is intellectual, some would say, to a fault.
Well, Dr. Will, there seems to be an incredible departure from this intellectual conservatism of late. And so I'm curious as to your...
You've noticed that, have you?
Right. And so the question is, how has it been lost, particularly when we look at the Trumpism or Trump-dominated Republican Party of today? You know, while President Trump is no longer in office, his ideas and those who follow Trumpism are still present, actively present within the Republican Party. And so how we've gotten to this place?
Oscar Wilde famously said, the way to handle temptation is to succumb to it. And many conservatives or so-called conservatives or former conservatives confronted with the populist temptation succumb to it. And whatever conservatism is, populism isn't. Populism, the core of populism is that public passions are generally wise and in any case self-ratifying and self-legitimizing, that public passion should be translated as directly as possible into public policy. And to do this, you need a strong leader, unconstrained by the separation of powers. None of this Madisonian nonsense about filtering and refining public opinion through representative institutions. This means, again, a departure from our governmental architecture, but also a kind of perpetual impatience and a susceptibility to not only a leader who will translate passions into policy, but a leader who will arouse passions. And Lord knows we've got one of those, had one recently in the 45th president. This makes for interesting, unstable politics, and we're in the midst of it now.
If we kind of expound on this a bit more, you talk about translating passions into policy and that, you know, enabling good legislation and state making and all of the above. But when we look at the past, 4 years previously to this current administration, there was an immense amount of anti-elitism in the U.S. And that had, at least in our view, me and Andre, and in this podcast, we talk about how that impacts the foreign policy community because that community is made up of elites. And so what is, in your view, the impact of this anti-elitism, both during the Trump era, but are there any kind of long-lasting impact that has had and carried over into the current administration?
Well, anti-elitism is a recipe for, at best, mediocrity. Grown-ups understand that the question is not whether elites shall rule, but which elites are going to rule. And therefore, the challenge of democracy is to get popular consent to worthy elites. That is the essential problem. To be anti-elite is to, A, question the existence of or value of expertise. And inevitably, it has a large anti-intellectual component because one of the ways we distinguish elites is by their special knowledge. Not just credentials, although that's important, but academic credentials. You rather scandalously referred to me at the beginning as Dr. Will, but leaving aside that kind of academic credential, it presupposes that A, expertise exists, B, that it matters, C, that it should be brought into policy making and policy administration. And there are those with a prickly democratic sensitivities who say, well, there's something inherently undemocratic about this. To which the answer is, yes, that's true. This is not we are a majoritarian country. We're committed to regular elections and majority rule up to a point. And that point comes pretty fast in foreign policy.
So speaking of foreign policy, I do want to get to your conceptualization of what a conservative foreign policy is. But before that, how do you view the state of U.S. foreign policy and national security today?
Well, first of all, it's a basic axiom of sensible reasoning that if you will an end, you have to will the means to that end. We have willed an end, that is, we're going to have an international orderly world, particularly with the 3/4 of the world that is covered with water. And we're going to have a big Navy, and we're going to have power projection, and we're going to have an armed forces sufficient for this multi-domain challenge. That means we are simply underfunding. We're not willing the means to that end. We are watching, to the surprise of no one, but to the alarm of all serious people, a pandemic of domestic spending, the institutionalizing of normal, routine, trillion-dollar structural deficits in the budget, which inevitably are going to crowd out defense spending. The Biden administration picked an odd time to suggest in its first budget shrinking in real inflation-adjusted terms the defense budget at a moment when our principal adversary, an adversary unlike any other in American history, China, is being aggressive and backing up its aggression with an astonishing explosion of spending on military hardware and people. There's been some pushback from this, but not enough. So Americans we're not writing checks to back up the goals we're stipulating.
So Dr. Worrell's Andre foreshadowed, when we talk about a conservative foreign policy, what does that actually look like in practice? Of course, defense budgets play into this, but also force projection and how domestic sort of interests are then expounded abroad. And so what is your conceptualization of a conservative foreign policy?
Well, conservatism, domestically and foreign, it's a seamless aspect of conservatism. Conservatism insists on flinty realism about the proper scope and actual competence of government. Conservatism says, be very wary of the phrase nation building, because that's almost as oxymoronic to a conservative as the phrase orchid building. Orchids are organic things. They grow slowly and after long evolution. So are nations. And the idea that we could do nation building in societies where the stony social soil is inimical to it is anti-conservative. The idea that we could, in Afghanistan, in the words of General McChrystal, bring in government in a box is preposterous. And again, not just unconservative, but anti-conservative. Someone once went to a baseball manager in spring training and said, "How's your team going to do this?" And he says, "We're just 2 players shy of the World Series." Unfortunately, those players are Babe Ruth and Lou Gehrig. When we went into Iraq, we were just a couple things shy of success. One, the social soil that would produce leadership class such as the United States had in the second half of the 19th century. We Iraq lacked George Washington, a unifying central figure, lacked a James Madison, a genius of constitutional architecture for figuring out how factions could live with one another, lacked an Alexander Hamilton, someone who understood political economy, lacked a John Marshall, who could talk about construing laws in a way that holds a society. In other words, we weren't even close. And conservatives understand that while projecting power is inherent in America's geography and ideology, it seems to me, not just the ideology that says national security is the first business of the national government, but also that says, as I indicated earlier, there is an inherently universalizing responsibility built into the American creed and the American identity, but it has to be managed carefully. And when it's not managed carefully, you get mission creep abroad and disastrous disillusionment at home.
So, and when we speak about presidents, and I know that you do have some criticisms of the idea that the president is really the sort of the one who we all look to, perhaps. But has there been any president who's sort of most closely followed a conservative foreign policy in in your mind?
I'll give you two. I think Eisenhower was quite good at this because he had been to war, a big war, and he'd shouldered responsibility, and he knew that force is a blunt instrument. I would like to have been in the room if someone ever used in Eisenhower's presence the idea of surgical strikes. War is not surgery. War is blunt instruments. But he shepherded the United States through a dangerous decade with minimal strife and maximum strength as we put in place the sinews of our deterrence. Second would be Ronald Reagan, who famously asked about how he saw the Cold War. He says, "We win, they lose." And that's indeed how it turned out. But it required a very complicated strategy of pumping up oil production around the world to drive down the strength of the Soviet Union's extraction industries, engaging in a kind of high-tech competition for which the Soviet Union, sclerotic that it was at that point, was singularly ill-equipped, maintaining pressure on the Soviet Union with a 600-ship Navy. He actually got to 597 ships, close enough for government work. Forward deployed Navy, applying constant pressure to the adversary. But without shots being fired, we won and they lost.
So with regards to President Reagan, many folks think of you as a big Reaganite, but in I think the second half of the 1980s, you did publish some articles that were critical of President Reagan's foreign policy. I think for me, I was reading the 1988 article, Foreign Policy That Bewilders. So has your view on President Reagan's foreign policy changed, or can you sort of explain that to us a little bit?
Yeah, my view has changed somewhat. That he was more right than I was about him. I remember one day sitting in my office and the phone rang and I pick it up and the operator says, "Please hold for the president," and I did. And Ronald Reagan came on. Now, I've knew Ronald Reagan pretty well. Came to my house 7 times for dinner as president. I got in a world of trouble for helping him prepare for the one debate he had in Cleveland with Jimmy Carter in the 80 campaign. Anyway, the president says, "George, I'm not enjoying reading you as much as I used to." And I said, "Well, Mr. President, I'm not enjoying watching you be president as much as I used to." And he laughed and said, "Well, come on down to the White House, we'll talk about it." And I did, and we did. I was more skeptical of Gorbachev than the president was. I didn't think he was quite Lenin with a better tailor, but I did not think also that he was aspiring to democracy. I thought, and I was right about this, that Gorbachev's aim, which happily failed, his aim was to fix the Soviet system. Perestroika and all that didn't work out. The system happily collapsed. But at that point, I thought Reagan was not as realistic as he should have been about Gorbachev. It turns out, as was often the case with Reagan, he was underestimated, in this case by me, which it didn't usually happen.
Dr. Will, if we go back a bit, I want to kind of touch on defense spending, just because you talked about kind of some ideals of conservatism, and one of which I think within a conservatism substance is this idea of a balanced budget, but also ensuring collective security. And so with that, of course, we see the budget and spending and the debt ceiling coming to a head in DC at the moment. And so within the conservatives' foreign policy, where does defense spending, but also foreign aid fit in? Is it the idea of too much or never enough?
Rarely enough in terms of defense spending. The U.S. geopolitical strategy has to revolve around the Navy, and the Navy is an expensive thing. I don't just mean the supercarriers and the carrier groups, but submarines, attack submarines, and all the rest. The future of the Navy, the foreseeable future of our Navy, is largely in the hands of the submariners. And the attack submarines, let alone ballistic missile submarines, are very expensive. But as the old saying goes, not as expensive as a war. Admiral Mullen, when he was chief of naval operations, famously said that the principal national security threat to the United States is the United States budget, because inevitably, when popular domestic spending and popular entitlement programs explode in an aging society, and the entitlement state's primary purpose is to transfer wealth from the working young and middle aged to the retired elderly in the form of pensions and health care. When this spending explodes, and it is popular, and it is impossible to cut, it's impossible to rein in even, inevitably, there are enormous pressures to crowd out defense spending, which is not popular. People would much rather spend on schools and grandma's wheelchair and that sort of stuff. So you combine the fact, the centrality of the Navy in our security and the explosive growth being made worse daily of entitlement programs and domestic spending, you have a recipe for the slow motion unilateral disarmament of the United States.
So now I do want to touch on liberal internationalism, namely in terms of how that sort of plays out in terms of U.S. national security. There are two presidents that come to mind with regards to this concept, George W. Bush with the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq, and then you've written quite a bit about Woodrow Wilson. Can you sort of discuss those two presidents, this idea of liberal internationalism, and perhaps what critiques you have of those two and that idea?
Well, liberal internationalism is sometimes presents itself as armed humanitarianism. Before I turn to Woodrow Wilson, about whom I can discourse negatively for hours at a time, I would call attention to Barack Obama's intervention in Libya. We intervened in Libya, so far as I can tell, precisely because it had no discernible connection with our national security. It was untainted by practicality. It was, remember, responsibility to protect, R2P. It was altruistic. And it was, I think it's fair to say, on balance, disastrous. A particularly kind of feckless use of American power. But again, a use of American power that recommended it to liberal humanitarian interventionists precisely because it was untainted by considerations of hard, clear national interest. Woodrow Wilson, of course, went in November of 16, he's elected as the man who kept us out of the war, the man who said you can be too proud to fight. And in April of 17, we're off to war, thanks to Germany and unrestricted submarine warfare. And Woodrow Wilson swung 180 degrees. He said, okay, we're going to go to war. We're not just going to war, we're going to end war. We're going to make the world safe for democracy, war to end war, all that stuff, with a kind of extravagant agenda to remake Europe while we were at it, create things like Yugoslavia with blithe disregard of matters like ethnicity and religion and other messy considerations. There's a wonderful vignette of Woodrow Wilson and I think Clemenceau in Orlando, Italy, at the Versailles Conference, on their knees, hands and knees, poring over maps, redrawing nations. Where does one start in saying this is a fool's errand, as indeed it turned out to be? So on the one hand, therefore, you must beware of using government as a tool for tasks for which is not suited, nation building, et cetera, I've already spoken to. On the other hand, as I've also said, Wilson did tap into something very American, which is that we are the custodians of certain universal propositions. We're a creedal nation. You're a nation, as Lincoln said at Gettysburg, dedicated to a proposition. And being dedicated to a proposition, we want to advance this universally, prudently, but universally.
Dr. Will, when we look at the sort of interventionist foreign policy that we've seen since the 1960s, that has been termed neoconservatism, particularly when we see that engaged in by a Republican president. I think George Bush emulates that certainly, but in the differentiation between conservatism and neoconservatism, particularly in foreign policy, in your mind, given, I think you identify yourself certainly as a conservative, where does neoconservatism go wrong? Is it that, you of course mentioned the failures of certain interventions, but they are seemingly in many instances necessary in order to uphold certain values and certain ideologies that America seeks to employ abroad?
The difference between conservatives and neoconservatives is a matter of degree, but sometimes the degree is so large it becomes a difference in kind. Neoconservatives, by the way, that term was first used to apply to people, certain thinkers in domestic policy, the people around the Journal National Public Interest, people like Moynihan, Daniel Bell, Nathan Glazer, James Q. Wilson, people like that, whose chastening theory for the country to consider was that social science, all the social scientists had piled into Washington during the Great Societies, and we're going to fix everything all at once. And these neoconservatives in domestic policy said, wait a minute, social science can't tell us what to do, it can tell us the results of what we're doing. And it was, the irony is that in foreign policy, neoconservatism was anything but chastening. It was, we can do everything. Look at these extraordinary precision munitions we've seen. And we remember we had, in the first Gulf War, we had the CNN and all those clips of precision weapons knocking down this building and not damaging that building. A kind of astonishing hubris was taken over about, again, the competence of government. So just as neoconservatives in domestic policy were saying government's not as competent as it thinks it is, in foreign policy, neoconservatives, and they're often different people, said government can do much more than you thought. I remember shortly after the war to chase Iraq out of Iraq, he said, well, Syria is next. Syria is low-hanging fruit. Good Lord, can you imagine if we had plunged into Syria, what fun we'd be having to this day? So again, prudence is the fundamental conservative virtue. Prudence doesn't eschew this kind of semi-missionary impulse that I think is an admirable part of American character and an inevitable part of American foreign policy, but it says handle with care.
So I guess in that vein, where did the U.S. really lose its way in the name of national security? When did we lose our way, if we ever had a way to begin with?
Well, after the Berlin Wall came down, 1989, and the Soviet Union disappears 2 years later, we had a kind of holiday from history. Let's say the parenthesis opened in 1989 and closed shortly after we got to Iraq. And suddenly we saw that we were in there on a mistake, that the weapons of mass destruction weren't there. And people in the Bush administration said, well, we'll just pivot. We'll find a new reason for this. And the reason was the famous freedom agenda. Most capaciously expressed in President George W. Bush's second inaugural address, where he said that we are going to advance freedom everywhere. You can't as long as we're rooted to this planet, you can't get any more ambitious than that. So I think that's where it changed. The people who put together the architecture of the Cold War, NATO and 49 and all of that, the Paul Nitzes and George Kennans and George Marshalls and Dwight Eisenhowers and others were hardly crusaders. They were hardly overreachers. They were wedded to the doctrine that military and economic strength tells in the end. And the trick in the Cold War was to hold things together and keep the pressure on until the Soviet Union changed. And they were crowned with success. I mean, it was a tremendous, in the history of human endeavor, the American Cold War campaign, lots of waste involved, of course, and some mistakes, but still, if you look at the proof in the pudding turned out to be pretty edible.
It seems like up until 9/11, America was riding high, celebrating the quote-unquote end of history, as some will see it, as many scholars saw it. But with 9/11, of course, we just remembered the 20th anniversary. We saw a lot of securitization in the post-9/11 era. America changed both at home and abroad, particularly when you look at legislation such as the Patriot Act, of course, our wars abroad. And so how do you see the post-9/11 era shaping American discourse at home as well as its actions abroad?
Well, the fundamental fact about 9/11, I think, as it struck Americans, was that those plane hijackers came from within the country. Now, I know 15 of them came from Saudi Arabia, but they were here when they got on those planes. And that made Americans look around and wonder how many more there might be. And all of this happened just about the time, I think it was June 2007, when this appeared, the smartphone. And the enormous importance of and the enormous potential for acquiring data. And so Americans, just at the time when they're getting used to these gadgets, said, oh my goodness, the government can scoop up all this data. Maybe it should, maybe it shouldn't, but we need rules. And we've been arguing about those rules ever since.
So in the aftermath of 9/11, we saw the Afghan and Iraq wars. We also saw a significant consolidation, I guess, of executive authority with regards to certain national security powers. We also saw this, expansive executive authority take place under the Wilson administration, not to bring up Woodrow Wilson again. But how do you view this consolidation of the executive, and do you think it can be reversed?
Well, Randolph Bourne, a progressive intellectual during World War I, shortly before he was killed by the influenza that was let loose by the war and spread by the war, Randolph Bourne said, war is the health of the state. James Madison had said, war is the health of the executive, because it's in foreign policy that the strongest argument can be made for executive power, for the ability to act with dispatch in a way that Congress, a committee today of 535 members, probably can't. And dispatch became more important as distance was annihilated, time and distance were annihilated by ballistic missiles and all the rest. So there's been an inevitable centralization of power in the executive, more inevitable in foreign policy than in domestic policy, but these two things went together. The president became swollen in all its domains. The result being that Congress has, for a number of years now, been trying to figure out how, if at all, it can restrain war making and the use of force by presidents. The War Powers Act, of course, has been honored in the breach only. Authorizations of the use of military force have been drawn up. I mean, we're still essentially operating under one that's 20 years old against ISIS. It was used against ISIS. It didn't exist at the time that the original authorization for the use of military force was passed. We're dealing with gray area kind of threats by non-state actors, which makes it doubly difficult to have due process in the unleashing of military power. But I actually think that the United States, and particularly Congress, has behaved reasonably conscientiously in this new area, with again a gray area with few boundaries, but trying to figure out the rules, and I think has been conscientious.
I think one area that I'd like to touch on would be the intelligence community and how we've sort of given away some of our freedoms in lieu of security. Of course, we can think to the NSA monitoring, the quote unquote surveillance state, but do the needs of security in some areas kind of, without a lack of a better term, trump the needs for our freedoms, particular freedoms when it comes to freedom of speech, but also freedom from the government infringing upon just our own kind of private information.
Clearly, with the kind of, again, non-state actors, the kind of low threshold violence that can be visited upon us. The fact that 19 hijackers did as much damage to the United States economy as it did. I mean, a tremendously efficient use of force by Al-Qaeda has clearly required us to rethink a lot of things. But Americans have been prickly in a healthy way about mass surveillance. All these wonderful computers out at the NSA that can scarf up a few billion phone calls and look for certain magic words make people nervous, and should. Congress has created this actually in 1978, the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Court. I actually have just written a column on an attempt to make the court's opinions public in a way that they're not, and to give people a First Amendment right of speech and press to have access to these. So we're still litigating this. And I think Americans have been, not Americans generally, but the intense, committed, and interested minority of Americans who drive these kinds of discussions have been very reluctant to say security trumps everything.
So looking to the present and the future of sort of broader U.S. foreign policy, we now sort of see China as our main competitor. We see this return to great power competition, and some are referring to U.S.-China relations as this new Cold War. And I'm not sure as to whether you agree or disagree with that conception, but you've written columns, at least I believe in March of this past year, referring to President Biden's foreign policy as Trumanesque, similar to Harry Truman's. But I do want to ask you, how has the president sort of managed U.S.-China competition, and how can a conservative foreign policy enable the United States to outcompete China?
Well, China is not only today's principal adversary, it's an adversary without precedence in the American experience. That is, it's an economically, China is an economic powerhouse, and China is deeply woven into the world's economy, the world's supply chains, and the US economy. This was not the case with the Soviet Union. I mean, think of a consumer product from the Soviet Union anyone wanted to buy besides caviar and vodka. They had extraction industries, and I suppose you could say vodka's extracting eggs from sturgeon, whatever. But basically, the Soviet Union was, as the derisive saying, had an upper volta with rockets. China's different. So what I meant when I said it was Truman-esque was the fact that Biden has spoken with Truman-like pungency, to put it mildly, about Xi, called him a thug, not a democratic bone in his body, he has said, just as Truman talked to Molotov when Molotov came into the Oval Office and Truman unloaded on him for the Soviet Union not keeping its agreements, Yalta and all the rest, with regard to Poland. So Truman-esque in the sense of the manner and tone of Truman's leadership, but Truman-esque also in the sense that Truman said, we need help, we need alliances. Just recently, the AUKUS, so-called Australia, United Kingdom, and United States Security Agreement, whereby Australia says, oops, we're not going to buy those $60 billion worth of diesel subs from the French. We're going to buy nuclear power subs from the United States are going to be built using U.S. nuclear technology that we had never shared before, except in 1958 with the British. So if Truman-esque in the second sense, that requires an architecture of security, and I think the president has been good at that. The Quad, that is Japan, Australia, the United States, and India. That's a remarkable lot of large populations and large economic forces to begin to put in place. I know we're not supposed to use the word, but it fits. This is about the containment of China. And when Australia says diesel subs won't do, we need nuclear power submarines, that's because they intend to go long distances toward China and stay on station stealthily. Now, when the Australia, UK, US agreement was unveiled, and a White House official said, and it's amazing that he managed to say this with a straight face, he says, this is not directed against any countries. Preposterous. Of course it's directed against China. I suppose speaking nonsense is part of diplomacy, but we don't have to call it anything other than nonsense.
Absolutely. We can leave that there. I want to begin to round out today's conversation by talking about your recent book, American Happiness and Discontents. Dr. Will, what motivated you to collect nearly 200 columns and make it into a great collection that is this wonderful book that Andre and I had the pleasure of reading? And who is your audience? Who do you hope will pick your book up and read?
Well, people who like the way I write to begin with, but people who want to say, look, this is an era from the Obama coming into the presidency to Trump being expelled from the presidency. This is a period that I don't think will be referred to as the era of good feelings 2.0. This is a particularly dyspeptic nation at the moment. And it's a nation whose troubles, in that book, I write very little about Trump, who doesn't interest me that much. He's an open book, has been reading himself to the country for 30 years, and there's nothing more to be said about him. But I'm a firm believer in the axiom that politics is indeed downstream from culture. And there's some cultural changes. We see it in the way we raise children. We see it in the way the children we raise go to universities and demand safe spaces and freedom from speech, not freedom of speech. So I'm interested in cultural changes that reflect and contribute to the disagreeable tone of our public life at the moment.
So how does history really figure into your selection of these essays? I mean, each essay was selected for a reason, right, for this book. So how does history really play in? Like, what significant lessons do you really want your readers to take forward, especially younger readers, perhaps in their 20s, their teens, and so on?
Well, it's been famously said that what we learn from history is that we don't learn from history. But my columns are thick with historic references. And indeed, it's very interesting that one of the things we're fighting over now is the teaching of history in America, for the reason that George Orwell put plainly in 1984, where he said, "He who controls the past controls the future, and he who controls the present controls the past." That's why we're fighting over the New York Times attempt to reframe, as they put it, the American history around the notion that we're a nation not dedicated to liberty, as Lincoln said, but born in sin and still steeped in sin over slavery. I don't remember who it was that said that history is philosophy teaching by example, but it really does help if people can learn as much history as possible so that we don't have to keep reinventing the wheel. That we've been here before, we've had lots of experience, which on the one hand helps us keep perspective. Because, oh gosh, things are just worse today than they've ever been. Oh, no, they're not. And it's useful to calm people down by saying, in fact, we've surmounted worse. And there are things to learn from history about the limits of our institutions and the durability of our institutions. People say, well, we're in a constitutional crisis. No, we're not. We've had one constitutional crisis, and that was 1861. That is a crisis in which our constitutional institutions could not cope. We had to resort to the Army of Northern Virginia, the rest to take care of this. I think history is worth teaching and it's worth fighting over.
Certainly can agree with that more, Dr. Will. When we talk about today, I think one of the greatest challenges is sorting through the noise and all the information, the misinformation. And so I'd love to kind of get your perspective on where we should look for news, for information. Where do you get your information from? You, of course, have mentioned a lot of great books and writers in this book that we're discussing at the moment. But are you a Twitter user? Do you go to social media? Are you where do you consume your news?
I'm told I have a Facebook page, but I've never seen it. Someone on my staff twice a week tweets 240, I don't know, maybe I'm out of date, 240 characters or whatever it is on Twitter. I've never tweeted myself. 240 characters come from my columns, so that I've never tweeted. I don't know how to tweet. I don't know how to find a tweet, for that matter. Social media seems to me, to put it mildly, it's a great disappointment. People said, oh gosh, there's going to be this cornucopia of information and this wonderful coming together of all humanity around the great campfire of social media. Not exactly. What social media has done for me is it's caused me to question what I think was my belief, that the quantity of stupidity relative to the size of a society's population was sort of constant over time. I don't think so. Or maybe it's just that social media gives such velocity to stupidity that I don't know the answer to that. But part of your question is, how do I stay informed and who do I read and trust? There's an enormous amount of exceptionally good writing going on. I mean, Wall Street Journal, editorial page, The Economist, Financial Times, Washington Post, New York. I read all that stuff. And then I read the aggregators, Real Clear Politics, Real Clear Policy, Real Clear World, Real Clear Defense, et cetera, et cetera. I'm uncommonly interested in judicial matters and judicial philosophy and constitutional law. So I read the Volokh Conspiracy website that's run in association with Reason Magazine and Reason Foundation, a bunch of libertarian law professors. There's plenty to do with that, and I don't really miss the cables. I come to the office at about 8:30 in the morning. I turn on the Major League Baseball channel, and I turn it off when I leave at about 6 o'clock. That's the people on the Major League Baseball network know what they're talking about. and they have numbers and facts and stuff. So it's not like normal cable television.
Absolutely. And my very last question touches on a subject that you've had some strong opinions about. Why don't you like denim?
Where do I start? I just got, of all the columns in that book, the one that's probably occasioned the most uproar is my Jeremiah against denim. I just got tired of sitting in airport concourses and a 40-year-old father with his 12-year-old son would walk by and they're dressed exactly alike. Running shoes, blue jeans, t-shirt, and if their mother's there, she's wearing blue jeans. And I thought, there was a time when we recognized different stages of life and we dressed accordingly, appropriately. What a odd word, appropriate dress for particular stages of life. Now there's no distinction whatever between a father and a son. We're sort of all, it's not that the children are growing up faster, it's that we've infantilized adults. The presentational side of being an adult has been lost in the plague of denim. And this is all part of this strange new modern business of parenting. You notice that the noun parent has now become a verb. And this has given rise to something called parental determinism, the belief that if you parent with sufficient skill, you can produce awesome children. Everyone can. And we'll be like Lake Wobegon, where all the children are above average. And the trouble is what we produced are risk-averse, bubble-wrapped, fragile, brittle children who, again, when they get to college, head straight for a safe space, which is an unfortunate thing. But I have a denim theory of history, I guess. I blame everything on denim at this point.
Well, I'm certainly going to go through my closet this afternoon and pick away all the denim. Dr. Will, we're going to leave it there. Thank you very much for a fascinating conversation across a variety of topics. I cannot suggest your book more to our audience. It will be linked in the episode description. Once again, sir, thank you very much for joining us.
I've enjoyed this very much. Thank you.
That was a fascinating conversation, honestly. A very intellectual conversation on intellectual conservatism. And Ryan, I think it's fair to say that right now, the conservatism that we see, or at least the conservatism that we think we perceive, is not really the intellectual conservatism, perhaps, that we talked about over the course of this episode.
I would agree with that. Certainly, there are definitely aspects of the Republican Party who many of them tout to be conservatives that certainly don't act particularly with intellectual conservatism. But I would say there probably still are members of Congress and the Senate that attempt to strive to, be intellectual conservatives. Putting that aside, again, really just as you said, Andre, a fascinating conversation with such an influential commentator on domestic and international politics and policy. And I think one thing in particular that is an important takeaway is not his, thoughts on jeans and denim, which was, quite interesting. And, Andre, I did go through my closet and I'm I'm just going to keep wearing jeans. I like them too much. But some of the things he said about really kind of what presidents that he thinks kind of upheld conservatism in their policies, there were Eisenhower and Reagan. And whatever you say about either of those presidents, whatever, your political differences, policy differences, I think his assessments of these presidents is incredibly accurate. And they both lived through very crucial times in the United States, particularly when it comes to foreign policy.
Yeah. And Ryan, I have an Eisenhower autograph right here. It's one of my most prized possessions, as I do a Reagan autograph, also a signed letter. I can talk about more of that later. But I think it's important to note that George Will actually voted for Joe Biden in the 2020 election. He did not vote for Donald Trump because he did not think that Donald Trump has a conservative foreign policy. Eisenhower and Reagan, Eisenhower, of course, very much an icon in terms of presidential politics and sort of presidential history, consistently ranked as like perhaps our fourth or fifth greatest president. Ronald Reagan, though, Dr. Will did not necessarily agree with Reagan on some pretty important things with regards to foreign policy in the 1980s. As Dr. Will recounted, he wrote this a column in the Washington Post called "Foreign Policy That Bewilders," and Reagan called him up and was like, George, I don't uh, enjoy reading you as much as I used to. And George said, I don't appreciate, seeing you as president as much as I used to. And George Will said he was wrong about Reagan with regards to a conservative foreign policy, that Reagan was underestimated by him, and that the end of the Cold War and so on it justified Reagan's foreign policy. And I think especially with regards to the Reagan foreign policy, he talks about not trusting Gorbachev, George Will not trusting Gorbachev. So I think that piece was very interesting.
Absolutely. And if anything else, you may have very strong opinions about George Will, his ideas, maybe even his thoughts on Reagan. At the end of the day, what this episode does, in my opinion, Andre, is it really elucidates the conservative frame of mind. And that's important because a big portion of this country shares those, values and ideas. And so in the United States, it's
we'd like to. Well, perhaps a big portion of the country shares those ideas, but again, remember, intellectual conservatism versus the populist conservatism that we're seeing right now. So a big portion of the country voted for Trump. George Will did not. And another note, not to have interrupted you, Ryan, but he talks about the Republican Party being the party of ideas in the post-war era. And that era of, the party of ideas has sort of died out with the Trump era. And whether or not you like Trump, it's a populist movement right now, which is a far cry away from the conservatism that George Will has, idealized. So I don't necessarily know if a large portion of the country shares George Will's ideas, but I also wanted to note he sort of likes Harry Truman to an extent. I think he likes Harry Truman because I've seen him write a lot about Harry Truman in sort of nice terms. He hates Woodrow Wilson.
Well, I mean, despite some of the things that Wilson did, particularly on the international stage, he was a bad guy, particularly when it comes to the rights of minorities in this country. So I do share George Will's contempt for Woodrow Wilson. But interesting, I will say, very interesting that he does like Harry Truman. That surprised me.
It's about the international order, and I think the international institutions that draw him to Harry Truman. But Ryan, are there any other thoughts you have on something other than presidents? Again, he also does not like the idea of the executive sort of having all this power. But that's for another conversation. But any last ideas?
The only last thing I'll say is that while he does believe in a strong United States, but particularly with more power in the hands of the people vis-a-vis Congress, we did talk about protecting your own information from the government. Of course, that is something we've talked about a lot on this podcast, is whether kind of the juxtaposition or the trade-off of giving up your information privacy in order to have a higher level of security in this country. And so I think his thoughts in particular were interesting. And he also has, thoughts about having more openness with the government. Of course, there's a lot of secrecy going on, and in many times it's justified, but there are certainly areas in which it's not justified. And so he's a writer, has written for the Washington Post for years. And so who wants transparency more than a journalist or a columnist?
Absolutely. And I think I really loved his line on social media, actually. He used to think that, it's not that many people in the country are stupid, but social media has tested his idea of how many people in the country are outwardly stupid. Folks, he has a great book out. It's called American Happiness and Discontents, just published actually within the last few weeks and released. His other book, The Conservative Sensibility, published in 2019, is, I think, a really great sort of encapsulation of some of these views on what conservatism means in a political discourse. And also, if you like sports, George Will has written Men at Work, The Craft of Baseball in 1990. I actually have a signed copy of that book. But he loves sports, he loves politics, he loves conservatism. fascinating guy, and we really appreciate him coming on. It was an honor to host him.
Absolutely. And if you enjoyed this episode, please rate, review, and subscribe to the podcast. Please give us your feedback. We will always be churning out episodes like this one. And so until then, enjoy.